All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online webinar. My name is Martina, and I'm here today representing the Confucius Institute for Business London at LSE. So we're here tonight to host this online webinar about China electric vehicles. Usually these events are hosted at LSE. They're called China Business Briefing, so they are usually face-to-face, but as you might have guessed, lately we switched everything online, so there we are. And usually these events are also open to public, but are also parts of our Chinese language and culture for business executive program. So tonight among the audience, we would have some of our former or current CLCB students, external guests, and also we would have about 10 people from our Chinese language and culture for business executive program 1 week taster. So for those of you who have already joined our webinars before, you probably already have heard about us, but a special welcome to all of you who are new to our webinars. So just a couple of information: the webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be accessible to any of the attendees afterwards. And at the end of the session, we will have a Q&A session. So feel free to ask your questions at the end. So if you're interested in similar events or would like to follow us, I will shortly be posting our LinkedIn profile in the group chat. So you're more than welcome to follow us and see if there are any other similar events you might be interested in. So now, without further ado, I will leave it to our Professor of Economic History at LSE, Professor Deng, who's usually our chair for China Business Briefing on campus, and we dragged him into our online webinar version. So without further ado, I will leave it to you, Professor Deng, and I hope everyone will enjoy the webinar.
Oh, thank you so very much, Martina. And hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for business briefing. This is our regular routine program. Today we have Paul Dupont again. We have him before. I introduced him last time. He's a consultant, a powerful, high-powered consultant of business, dealing with non-Chinese firms starting business inside China. And we have a special link between me and the Paul, simply because we actually linked to a university we both worked at one time. So our basically path crossed sometime, something like 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Anyway, Paul's topic today is Chinese, kind of a sort of a mini revolution in vehicle. It's not a normal type of vehicle. It is a battery-powered vehicle. So this is the really avant-garde frontline development, basically affecting everybody's everyday life. So without any further delay, Paul, it is yours.
Cool. Thank you, Professor, for a very warm welcome. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Just to check, you can hear me and you can see me? Oh, super, in that case.
I can see you, yes.
Put up my screen so that you can also see that. Super. Can you see my screen? Wonderful. Okay. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Today, or rather this evening, I want to talk a lot about electric vehicles, specifically those which are manufactured in China, and how essentially that market has come from nothing, pretty much 10, 12 years ago, to a really considerably important part of both China's policy and also generally business. So, hang on, there we go. Right. So before I do that, I'll just introduce myself quickly. So as I said, I'm Paul Dupont. I've been helping lots of companies expand their operations to China over the last 10 years or so. Some of that was done working at Intralink, which is a market entry consultancy based in Shanghai. And then, as Professor Dung mentioned, I also worked at Victoria, helping the New Zealand government understand a little bit more about how to engage with China as well. And then presently, I'm working for Pointer, which is a startup that does digital transformation projects around the world, but actually with a very strong emphasis on APAC region and Hong Kong and China as well. So I've been working with a variety of clients over the days, and pretty much my favorite space to work in was the automotive space. And during that time, I represented quite a few different automotive clients, some more famous, for example, NASCAR in China. That was fun. And then Nissan, that was their electric vehicle division. Torotrack was a company specialized in new energy systems, and Magtech the same. And so in each of these cases, we went in to go and understand the electric vehicle market, the new energy vehicle market, and how a foreign company can expand in there. And so really what I've done for today's presentation is kind of distill a lot of the good stuff from all those projects into an agenda that hopefully by the end of it, right after we've been through kind of a very brief introduction to China's automotive industry and how where the motivation to build EVs came from, and then all the amazing stuff that's happened over the last 10 years. Hopefully by the end of that, you'll leave as excited about me about kind of the potential of EVs in China and abroad as well. So should be quite a positive presentation. Great, so I'll just get stuck into it. So to do that, I just want to first set the scene of all the different electronic vehicles, and to be specific, today we are talking just about passenger electric vehicles. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about the humble passenger electric vehicle, which has a curb weight of over 800 kilograms, a range of over 80 kilometers on the battery alone, without any other source of propulsion, a minimum top speed of over 100 kilometers an hour, and the ones I'm talking about today are specifically the ones made in China, not imported. So what we're not going to talk about, sadly, today is about commercial vehicles. For example, this lovely electric bin truck that this unfortunate model was forced to stand next to for the entire duration of this show, or indeed electric buses. We're also not talking about this wonderful electric bus up in northern China that would glide over the top of traffic that got stuck and then sadly turned out to be a hoax. We're also not talking about this incredible electric vehicle, which is known as a low-speed electric vehicle. It is a category of EV, which you find a lot in rural China, that has a very small lead-acid battery that will power it for about 50 kilometers, does a top speed of 50 kilometers an hour. You don't need a driving license to drive it. Really also incredibly interesting industry to look at. And I strongly recommend anybody who's interested in looking at these. I can't imagine where they got the inspiration for this one. But anybody who's interested in looking at that, I can't recommend more this website, carnewschina.com. It's fantastic. We're also not going to talk about Chinese race cars, but we are going to talk about the brand that made this car, NIO, which is a domestic startup in China that is working is one of the leaders, in fact, in electric vehicles, not just in China, but also around the world. It was a really interesting company. So, okay, we know what we're going to talk about. So I'm just going to dive into it, but I think it's important to have a little bit of context about the automotive industry in China. So let's start at the beginning. At the beginning, back in the mid-80s, China decided to get serious about cars. It looked at Japan, it looked at Korea, all these cars being built and these successful car companies that were exporting their cars around the world. And then there was, why don't we have this? In 1984, China produced a grand total of 5,040 vehicles, right? Basically nothing. And all the vehicles that were coming in were imported through a range of methods, which are also some legal, some not so legal, very exciting. But essentially what the government decided to do was look to foreign players to help bring in the technology required to build up that industry. And so it assigned its state, its state-owned companies, these absolute beasts, to form joint ventures, right, with a 50-50 venture between the state-owned company, which would provide the manpower, the factory space, the market, the distribution, and then 50% would belong to the foreign brand, the foreign OEM. For example, Jeep was the first, Volkswagen the second, and then there were some others that came down the line later. So these joint ventures would bring the foreign technology, the parts, all that stuff. They would assemble it in China and then sell it into the market. So what happened was it started through the 80s. These joint ventures formed between foreign players and local state-owned beasts. 1990s, more joint ventures were allowed into the country, or allowed to start rather in the country. More foreign players were allowed to enter, and there was not only competition between joint ventures that started, but also between cities. In every city, you would have the state-owned company and its foreign partner. And so what you'd find is whenever you went to each city, you would find a taxi that would be made by the company of that joint venture, right? So Shanghai would be Volkswagen's, Beijing would be Hyundai's, Wuhan would be Citroen's. Then 2000s, that's when things start to go a bit crazy. The number of people buying cars just goes wild. The growth in public and private ownership of cars really develops. And following that, the tier ones. So the tier ones are the part manufacturers who sell bits to car brands. So for example, Brembo sells its brake pads to brands. So these tier ones who manufacture product locally, they start to get very rich as well, supporting. So the whole industry, the whole ecosystem begins to form. And towards the end, the government realizes that, yes, we have this industry forming, and for various reasons I'll go into in a moment, we also want to start building a new type of vehicle, an electric vehicle. And over the last 10 years or so, it's gone from nothing in terms of electric vehicles in a country where in 2010, the auto market was worth 7.4% of GDP, right? An enormous portion, right? And in a country where China is by 2012 was the world's biggest polluter, and then by 2018, by far the biggest market in the world for vehicles, with 28 million vehicles sold and 1 million electric vehicles sold. So there is a sense of urgency around developing electric cars that emerges. And really, I love this picture. Before I get into the motivation for electric vehicles, I just want to show this. This is one of my favorite pictures. I was in a lay-by somewhere in central China, and I got out the car and saw this, a truck carrying 14 trucks. I don't think anything can really symbolize the size of the automotive market in China more than that, right? And just to highlight that, last year, in fact, the total number of vehicles went down from 2018 to 25 million. But just compare that to America, where only 17 million are sold, right? The size of the market is just vast. Okay, and one more picture before I get into the motivations. That's around just how rich the tier ones, the manufacturers that were providing parts in China, like they would just stamp metal or whatever, and then sell it to the joint ventures who would then assemble the cars. This is a company that specialized in making alloy wheels. And when I went to their factory in 2016, this is actually their factory building. They had 8 of these in a row in central Zhejiang. It was just something else, right? These Versailles style buildings, and then a 4-lane highway that probably only has 20 cars a day going up and down it. Right. So we know the size of the market. We know it's huge, and we know that China put a lot of emphasis on electric vehicles. But let's look at why, and then let's look at how they got to where they did. So what was the government motivation? What was the motivation in general to build electric vehicles? The first, quite obviously, anybody who's spent any portion of time in China will know about, is reducing the overall level of pollution, which has steadily increased and is in part linked to the fuel consumption of privately owned or commercially owned vehicles. And pollution has been recognized for over 10 years as a really significant threat to the stability of the country economically, politically, ecologically. And so there was a decision made to understand how they can reduce pollution with electric vehicles. Next is around ensuring the fuel security of the country. So China is heavily dependent on oil imports. And as a factory boss who made turbochargers for tanks once told me, you can't power tanks on electricity. So there needs to be a certain supply of oil in order to maintain the overall running of the country, and yet you also need to diversify away from it in order to ensure your security there. And one way to do that is to reduce the amount that people use when they're driving around. Next, and this is probably less important, well, it was as important back in 2010 as it is now, but less emphasized than it is now. And that's around boosting the capability, China's domestic tech capability. So up until this point, in the auto market particularly, China was incredibly dependent on, and still is actually, on foreign automakers, on their designs, on their technology, on their processes, in order to make cars and then make cars good, right? And then sell them into the market. To date, there's only a few, handful of Chinese, wholly Chinese brands that are successful in the passenger vehicle market. And so the rest, the vast majority are JV vehicles, right? They're joint venture vehicles. So being able to find a way to leapfrog, right? Get out of that always chasing the foreign manufacturer in terms of technology, and finding a way to be the one who is innovating and boost that made in China brand, both domestically and abroad, was a big priority. Retaining profits on auto sales. So we saw, 7.4% of your GDP, if based on the sales, a lot of that money, 50% of those revenues don't stay in China. They go to the JV, to the foreign partner of the JV. And that money gets shipped out in the form of either dividends as profits, or more commonly, the foreign OEMs will sell parts at a really thick margin so the foreign, for example, GM in the US will sell parts to GM in China, to the Shanghai GM joint venture, with a big margin on top, which is a very effective way for them to extract money from the country. So being able to have an entire auto ecosystem within China, where the tier ones, the tier twos, the OEMs, they're all domestic, so the money stays in the country, and then the profits get pumped back into R&D, pumped back into the country. Very important. So all of these motivations essentially came to an objective which was announced in 2009, 2010, which was to have 5 million electric vehicles on the road in China by 2020, along with 4.8 million charging stations, which was considered like a very ambitious target back then. And even in 2016, I wasn't convinced that this was going to happen, but as we'll see, they've pretty much done it. So, right, the government has decided that everyone's going to drive EVs from now on. It's decided that there's going to be 5 million by 2020, and everything we've looked at so far is incredibly top down. It's all, at no point in the last bit have we asked the consumer what they want to drive, right? It's only been the government saying, you know, you're gonna buy and you're gonna drive EVs, but of course the market needs to be able to accept that. So let's take a look at the market, and this is very much based on a lot of research that we did in the market, understanding what the market actually wants, and then kind of OEMs will be able to fit halfway between, you know, the government motivation and the market demands to come up with the right products. So market demands, first and foremost. If you want to sell electric vehicles to anyone, those electric vehicles have to be affordable, right, relative to an ICE, an internal combustion engine, like a normal petrol car. It has to be relatively, for the same performance, the same price. And not just that, but it also has to have a range of over 300 kilometers. This is a number that came up time and time again when we talked to both users, to the people who sold EVs, you know, in the dealerships, to the OEMs. That was very much the target range. Next, they need to be easy to charge, right? There's no good having an electric car if you can't plug the thing in. So it needs to be available. If you're a personal user, it needs to be available at home and at work. And very importantly for taxis, which, as we'll see, are kind of a very important early adopter for electric vehicles, the vehicle has to be, a taxi should be on the road all the time, right? It shouldn't ever be sat doing nothing. That's money wasted to a taxi company. And so not only does it have to have a long range and be affordable, but it also has to have, as we discovered, a 1 hour charge time. That was pretty much the acceptable period of time that a taxi company was willing to wait for a car to be fully charged. So it needs its 300 kilometers in 1 hour. The car has to be reliable. No good buying a car if it breaks down. And the key kind of goal in terms of reliability that people have been talking about over the last 10 years is called million-mile battery, which, if you follow along in the news, you'll see that this is only just, I think, in the last 2 or 3 months being announced as ready for production. So a million-mile battery is a battery that you can stick into an electric car, and it will keep driving you at that 300 kilometer range for 1 million miles, which for context is to the moon and back twice. That's the requirement. And then, of course, also it's no good buying a car at all if you can't repair it. So there needs to be a good network of distribution of maintenance and parts. And more importantly, over the last, this is kind of something that has been considered more over the last few years, is the way that you pay for your car. So when you buy a car, you don't necessarily buy the whole thing outright. You get a loan, and when you get a loan on a car, it's very easy for the person giving you the loan, the bank giving you the loan, to look at the car, look at you, and then figure out how much money they're prepared to stump up. Which didn't exist for electric cars. And so there was a really big domestic push to get banks on board into payment plans. And then lastly, and this is also something that's often overlooked, you also need to be able to sell your car after a few years. So the car needs to have warranties, it needs to have standards, it needs to be easy to sell. You need to, when you're buying your car, you need to know how much you're approximately going to get for it. So, you know, I've put that blue book here, which I guess is the term for it in the US at least, where you can just look in, see how much your car is worth for a certain condition in so many years. And that's very difficult to do with a brand new product that has only been on the market for a couple of years. So building up that ability to resell a car has been very difficult to do, and I think it's one of the last big problems to crack in terms of electric vehicles, especially in China. So we know what the government wants, we know what the market wants, how are we going to get there? And that's pretty much the story of the last 10 years, right? As this is a government initiative, it's the government's responsibility to kick things off. And so the government back in 2009 and 2010 came up with its Plan A, right? Let's call it. So Plan A is, I promise you, I think this is the last of the boring slides. We get into much more interesting slides in a minute. But the Plan A was to deploy huge amounts of subsidies. And so these subsidies are due to end in 2022. They've been going on for about 12 years. This is the first, the supply side production subsidy, where OEMs and tier ones can get money from the government for meeting certain production goals in terms of electric cars. So they make enough electric cars and they receive a ton of money. And what that did is it caused 400, apparently, I've not counted them, but 400 electric vehicle brands to sprout up over the last 10 years. Just astounding. Next comes, so the last one is supply side. This one is very much demand side. So purchase subsidies. So when you're going out and buying your vehicle, back in 2015, you could get 60% off the sticker price of your car in subsidies. And you would get a national subsidy and you'd get a provincial subsidy. And that would vary slightly. And the way they did it was the provinces, they base their subsidy on the length of the car. And so the local producer would be asked to make its car a certain length so that only their cars would get that subsidy. And so anyway, that's China, I guess. And then the next part is like a purchase tax exemption as well for the user. These subsidies, while great, caused a huge quantity of subsidy abuse, where in the most famous, well, there are two huge famous scandals. The one is a company called Candy in Hangzhou that they would make a car, sell it to their own taxi company. The price at which they sold it, minus the subsidies, was less than the total amount of subsidy. So on each car they sold to themselves, they would make money from the subsidy. So they would sell it to themselves, they would strip it down, they'd send it back to the factory and they'd make it, and they made a fortune doing that. It's super interesting. There's a whole bunch of articles about how they did it. And then the second is in commercial vehicles, bus companies would they would sell their buses, they would collect the subsidies, but they would never actually fulfill the orders. And so, the government realized around 2015 that all this abuse was going on, and so it started a very rapid decrease in the amount of subsidies. The one subsidy which is unlikely to go anywhere anytime soon is the license plate subsidy. So anybody who's tried to buy a car in China will know that you don't just buy the car. You in a big city anyway, in the biggest cities, you don't just buy the car, but you also need a license plate for that car if you want to drive on the city's bigger roads at rush hour. And that can cost up to, well, 12 grand in Shanghai, I think it is right now, if you want to buy that plate. And you have to enter a lottery. So every month you have a 5% chance of being able to buy a plate for £12,000. And if you can't get the plate, then you can't buy the car. So what they offered for electric vehicles was an instant plate for free, which for a lot of companies and for a lot of private users, a huge motive, a huge incentive to go out and buy electric vehicles. And then I think it's the last one, usage subsidies, so discounts on electricity and for battery swapping. So after all that subsidy abuse, the government came up with a Plan B. And the Plan B has been in the works for quite a long time, at least 6-7 years. And it is called the dual credit system. And the onus is on electric vehicle, or just generally automotive manufacturers, to meet certain fleet average fuel consumption credits. So each time they sell a car, that car's fuel consumption is added to a tally, and then it's averaged over the total number of vehicles they sold. And then that fleet needs to meet 8.1 liters per 100 kilometers in 2010, 5 in 2020, and 4 in 2025. And electric vehicles can be counted up to 5 times in this average. And so essentially what that means is the OEMs need to produce enough electric cars to bring that fuel consumption down to this target in order to not get a fine, although the fines have never really been defined, or worse, be blacklisted from the market where they wouldn't be allowed to sell their cars anymore. So far, this hasn't happened, and everyone's kind of waiting to see what will happen when they don't make the target. And then second to that, so that's the first set of credits. The second set of credits is that when you sell an electric car, you as the OEM, or actually no, when you produce an electric car, you as the OEM receive a different level of credits for that car. 2 for a plug-in hybrid, and then 5 for a battery electric vehicle. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's roughly it. And their total fleet, they need to have enough credits so that the equivalent number of electric vehicles based on that credit system comes to 12% of their total internal combustion engine production, which is not sales, it's production. And so what happened was, actually, the OEMs didn't need to sell these cars, they just need to make them. And this average actually turned out to be quite high. So the policy kind of backfired a little bit, because it turned out for the OEMs it was cheaper to make and not sell electric cars than it was to improve the fuel performance of the other 88% of their fleet, which is petrol powered. And so the government had another problem there, right, which was a complete lack of investment in petrol technologies, and because people favored, these OEMs favored producing electric cars because it was cheaper. And so the government has then revised this plan in 2020 to reduce the value of these credits and also reduce the way that the credits can stay around till next year. So we're going to see over the next year or so whether or not that has a significant impact on the way that electric vehicles are actually sold. And there's a very interesting report that I've put a link to at the bottom. Okay, so we know what the government did, we know what the market wanted, and we know why they did it. What happened over the last few years? So I think, I promise you this is the very last boring slide, and then we get into prettier slides. So here we have, this is the top few electric vehicle brands or models rather sold in June 2020, which is the most recent set of statistics. You might be wondering why the Tesla is there. Well, you probably don't if you read the news. Tesla produces its Model 3 in China and sells it for £33,000 equivalent after subsidy. So all these after subsidy. And you'll see that, so in 2015, EVs typically had a range of less than 200 kilometers. So you can see in just 5 years from looking at this, just what an impact on sales, or just what an impact generally, those requirements or the market requirements for higher range have had, right? All these vehicles are pretty much all of them are 400 plus, except for this one, which I'm going to show you in a moment, which is a fantastic little car with 300 kilometers for £7,000. Yet the rest are all, really long distance vehicles, which is great. And all of those incentives, all of that R&D that's gone into building these cars has essentially grown the total number of EV sales since 2015 from basically nothing to 2019, when 1.2 million of these were sold, with a total of 3.8 running on the road, right? So you can imagine by the end of this year, with another 1.2 million sold, the government meets that 5 million car on the road target, which, you know, I wouldn't have thought possible back in these days. And you can see what the impact of reducing subsidies has on cars, right? So there was a big cut in subsidies in 2018, and it's kind of reduced the growth a bit, but it's not killed it. And that's the important thing. So we know all this, but do we know who's buying these cars? Who is it that's driving demand for these cars? And who is it who's pushing up that curve of electric vehicle adoption? So we can, you know, take this chart. It's a bit cliched, I know, but it's very useful in this situation, which is our adoption curve, right? Which shows the percentage of innovators, early adopters, and the relative market share over that period of time. And we can kind of apply the EV market to that. So if we look at 2010, 2015, what we see is essentially these are the innovators. So these are the fleet companies. So generally, these are government-backed companies that operate taxis or commercial vehicles or whatever. These are the ones who are being told by the state to go out and buy cars. And I love this picture. This is, I went to go visit an electric taxi fleet in Hangzhou at one point by the West Lake. And then I just gate crashed pretty much and walked in and had a chat with this chap who's the boss. And he took me in and fired up all this stuff to show me all these amazing analytics that they have in this room, showing where all their vehicles are, how they move around, their total consumption, all this stuff, right? So this was really like a lot of the early push to get electric vehicles out there was from the state, from this sort of entity. And so, yeah, we've got the taxi fleet operator, we've got government officials, and then of course we've got the savvy OEMs that we talked about who are abusing subsidies. So these are pretty much the innovators who push the initial production and sale of EVs. Then what we're getting 2016 onwards is the urban trendsetters who are buying Teslas and the rural residents who are buying charge-at-home vehicles. And they're the ones who are really pushing us up this curve to where we are today, which is still very much in the early adopter pack, with like a total market share of EVs of around 8%, of, you know, all automotive sales in China. So if we look at that curve, right, we know it's been largely taxi-based vehicles that have been driving this. And then here we see the urban trendsetters who've been going after fashionable vehicles. If we look forwards, what kind of EV do we expect to be able to push demand even higher up that curve to the early majority and beyond? So if we look at what's happening right now, and we look at sales from January through March of this year, what you'll see is the top 3 electric vehicles are all these sedans. So number 1 is the Tesla Model 3 made in China. Number 2 is the BYD Qin Pro. And then number 3 is this EU series, right? You kind of see a trend, 4-door sedans, all with a good long length and a good range. And these have been so far driving a lot of this EV consumption. But what we expect to happen in the future is and what we're seeing in terms of growth is the fastest growth is actually coming from these crossover SUVs. And blimey, they look futuristic. So these are all Chinese brands of crossover SUVs, so small 4-door SUVs. And what we're seeing that's driving the purchase of them is size, right? People love SUVs, especially in China. And they're able to produce them at a reasonably good price, you know, on the order of between 20 and 30,000 pounds as the sticker price on these things after subsidy, which is, you know, astounding. They have all invested significantly in charging, but yet the ability to charge is a key purchase factor. Branding, you'll notice that all these companies spend a fortune on branding, on getting their name out there and being the most innovative companies. And they're also, as we'll see in a moment, putting in fantastic features into their cars to woo over a tech-savvy audience, which China is increasingly becoming. From 2020 onwards, we looked at that chart showing 500-kilometer ranges. Range anxiety is going to be less important to buyers of these cars, right? So pre-2015-16, that was probably the most important purchasing factor to consider, was how far you could drive the car. Now, honestly, it's just not an issue, right? With distances like that for almost everybody. And so if you look at Nissan, for example, they just released the new Aria, which fits exactly into this category. And you can expect to see a lot of vehicles like this be released over the next 2 to 3 years. And talking the next 2 to 3 years, what are these cars going to look like? And so I kind of want to take an extreme point of view from the smallest to the biggest, and then take a look at the interiors as well. So at the smallest end, we can look at this. This is the Boggling E300P. Which is a brilliant little thing, released earlier this year, only a couple of months ago. I mean, look at that thing. It's actually got 4 seats. You can buy it after subsidies for £7,100 in China. It's not available for export yet, but it's a cool little thing. It's full of technology, great for somebody who lives in a small town outside the big cities and just needs it to drive to work and back, or maybe take their kids to school, sort of thing. And then at the other end, we've got this, right? This is the Hongqi, the red flag EHS9. I mean, look at that. For £35,000, right? What are you going to buy? Are you going to buy a Tesla Model 3, or are you going to buy this monster? And it's fantastic. I would love to be the one who turns up to a meeting in this. And I can see a lot of people also coming on with that. So, and this is, the whole EV thing is a real lease of life for Hongqi that has typically not been in that consumer segment. It's been very high end, and so the EVs are allowing them to kind of come down to a more consumer segment, which is also interesting to see. Then, if we look at the interiors, so Xpeng, another brand, they're kind of famous for the technology that they pack into an EV. Again, very, very interesting company. They don't actually make their own cars yet, although I think they're planning to soon. They have a contract to do that. So this is the car down here. It's quite an attractive looking saloon, and you can see it's borrowed elements from Tesla in terms of the 2 screens, but then this big old screen here. But why limit it to one small screen when you can have the Byte on M-Byte with this frankly enormous widescreen in front, and then for good measure another screen on the steering wheel. There's actually another screen further lower down that's not included in this image, and sadly Byton has stopped production and stopped business temporarily while they figure out what they're doing, which I think is code for being acquired or going bust. But still, like a very exciting company, and hopefully we'll see this sort of thing come back. You can definitely tell that they're focusing on a younger crowd and on autonomous vehicles, right? With this kind of entertainment setup, which is again another really interesting aspect of EVs that I don't know if I'll have time to touch on. And then lastly, I want to show you this. This is so the past 2 have been more about technology. This is more about experience. So ignore this, what they call the KOL setup, which is for fashion, people in fashion to record their product pictures while they're on the move. But take a look down here at the bottom right. This is the boss seat. So when you're being driven around, you can sit here, kick up your feet on the front, very much like something that we've seen in when foreign companies entered China, was they had to make the wheelbase of their cars longer in order to accommodate the boss who sits at the back and needs to stretch out. And you know what, like you see in the same again, even in this futuristic stuff, which is cool. And the great thing about this iWays U5 is from next year it'll be available in the UK for £25,000, which is pretty cool. So those are the cars. What about charging? And I realized that we are running low on time, so I'm going to go through this as quick as possible. But I just want to look at the infrastructure that's around charging. So in China, we have three types of infrastructure for charging. The first is battery swapping, which I'll show you in a moment, very interesting. And then the second two are either slow or wireless charging or fast charging, but primarily through cables. And what you can see here is these charging piles have really gone. I went to go meet the boss of Teld, which is the largest provider of charging piles a couple of years back, who was telling me about this plan to deploy, and I was like, oh yeah, that sounds exciting. And they've really done it, right? They've actually gone away and installed all these. Amazing. Charging station will look like this. This is actually the Westlake Taxi Company again, and you can kind of understand when you see all these taxis here doing nothing but charging, why that's so expensive for a taxi company and why they need a fast charging system. So I want to show you, this is a video I took while I went to visit an early battery swapping station in China back in 2016. So this is a taxi company in Hangzhou, where they have the batteries stored down in here. And really, to show you this, I just want to show you how far things have moved and how fast they've moved. So 4 years ago, they were changing batteries like this. They got, one second, so they had a forklift truck, drove up to the car, they put a mat down, and then they had to, the two guys that would pull out these heavy batteries. You can see him do it there. Out onto the forklift truck, and then somebody would whisk off the batteries to this charging station here, where they put them in manually and let them charge, while another one went over to the other bank, got four more new batteries, and then I think they pushed me out of the way at this point. And then he goes back around to the back of the car, they put the new ones in, they install them like that, and then the chap sits in the back, he puts down the batteries back into position, climbs out the car once they're in, shuts the boot, and then away the driver goes in 5 minutes and 49 seconds, which in a way is impressive, but I mean, this is not a scalable solution, right? Whereas now, and very handily, this TV show, Fully Charged, I recommend take a look at it, released the latest Neo battery swapping station just a couple of weeks ago. So this is definitely not my film, but you can see this is the Neo ES8, a larger SUV, electric SUV. They drive it into the charging station, and then the entire process takes 3 minutes. It aligns the car on the plates, comes up here, removes the batteries. Again, I'd really recommend watching this show. It's pretty good. As long as YouTube works. And then after a few minutes, they'll drive it back out with a fresh new battery and another 600 kilometers of charge, right? So this whole process is totally automated. So when I saw that one in Hangzhou, I thought to myself, there's no way they're going to make this into a scalable product, especially when you take into consideration factors like temperature in northern China, where it regularly gets to -20. And to be honest, I still don't know how they've solved that for this one, which heavily impacts battery life. But still, you can start to see this turn into a real solution that for a taxi company or for people on the go, this is a very attractive way of changing your battery. Of course, Neo and other providers also provide a mobile charging where they'll either drive a truck to your car. So in this instance, sort of ironically, a Tesla is getting charged by a Neo truck. And this is also something that you see in compounds where they can't install, so like compounds of flats where you can't install chargers. they will have somebody who whisks around a battery and plugs it into your car when you go to bed, and then we'll charge it so it's ready for the morning. And then lastly, over the next 5-10 years, I would expect to see wireless charging start to come in. So earlier this year, I think it was the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology in China approved a national standard, Guobiao, for wireless charging in collaboration with Witricity, which is an American wireless charging firm. And the idea here is that you can just drive your car onto this pad and it will start charging straight away. No cables, no swapping, no anything. Due to the sheer infrastructure cost and of both the car, which would need to have a standardized charging system, and also putting this into tarmac, I would expect to not see this develop for a good few years. All right, I'm really going to power through this. So the next 10 years, what do we expect? Number one is, right, this is just a list of some OEMs, EV OEMs that I found online, right? There's only about 70 of them here from that list of 400. This is a huge number, right? This is not sustainable. So what I expect to happen over the next 10 years is a big consolidation of all these brands as some go bust, as the ones marked with an X already have. The ones, and this is the big opportunity here, the ones that survive, the small startups that survive, the Neos and the Xpungs, and the ones that can build a brand, can comply with the ZEV policies, and can survive from a cash flow point of view, they're going to be acquired eventually by the large state firms, when the state firms need to meet the ZEV policies, the emission policies. And that is going to generate massive returns for the investors in these startup, in these vehicle startups. So I mean, that's really where I see a big opportunity. It's a real lottery for picking the right one, which is going to succeed. I also expect to see more people more sales to happen in rural markets, not city markets, as we can see here. So black is city markets and red is rural markets. And the reason for that is, over the last few years, right, so the total number of EVs in rural markets has increased hugely. The reason being that it's much easier to charge your car if you live in a suburb or in the countryside than it is in the city. Because it's, if you live in a compound, it's hard to install a charging system. So I'd expect to see more and more sales, and that goes hand in hand with SUVs that are more suited to that kind of environment. Exports, right? China is already exporting. Some of these brands are already exporting cars to, for example, the MG is coming home to the UK, and already has a 10% market share of EVs in the UK. And then there will be more. There's for example, the iWays U5, which is coming in. And then you, as a foreign company, how can you get involved? So it's already going to be very difficult to start up a car or to form a joint venture now. But where you can get involved is in selling advanced materials, is in selling anything to do with autonomous driving, LiDAR systems, edge processing hardware that can do computation in the car, or it doesn't need a server somewhere in the cloud to do the computation. ADAS systems, driver monitoring, image processing. And then if you're interested, here's a handy list of companies that you can go after. So I'm just going to, that didn't work, did it? I just want to do a very quick set of conclusions. So before 2020, massive amount of money was put in by the Chinese government to build this industry, and from nothing to 8% of the market, and that was done through subsidies. But now the subsidies, they're not working, so the government has changed tack to put huge pressure on OEMs to deliver electric vehicles. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause huge consolidation, which means big opportunities for the brands that survive. We're going to see more and more technologies coming out of China for EVs. And my honest belief is that in 2030, there'll be 8 million EVs sold in China, in that year alone, which will represent a roughly quarter of the total market if we consider current ongoing numbers. So I just want to leave you with one last picture of this Hongqi concept car that sadly isn't going into production. I mean, just look at that. Who wouldn't want that? Half Bentley, half BMW. It's fantastic. And so if anybody wants to ask any questions, I guess now's the time. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. Very sort of enlightenment kind of a talk. Can I raise the first question before I go for the floor, so to speak? You haven't mentioned the batteries, which is the hard sort of a factor of making the whole business available. So
you're right.
The question is, do the Chinese build their own batteries successfully?
Yeah, so you're right. I didn't go into batteries. I wanted to, I just couldn't squeeze it in. And so, I mean, China has the majority of the world production for batteries, as well as for the natural resources that go into the batteries. So, you know, while there are some companies like LG and Samsung that have good market share, predominantly through selling into Tesla, the rest of the batteries that go into these vehicles are generally made by Chinese companies in order to qualify for subsidies. So the batteries are just not commercially viable if they in the market if they don't come from a Chinese company. Right. And that's not the only reason, though. As a result of that, of all the money these Chinese battery producers like CATL have made, they've been able to invest heavily into R&D. And so, you know, there's probably 3 or 4 large Chinese companies like CATL or Gotion or a couple of others that between them have the majority of the market share, as well as some really great technology. Although parts of the batteries do still depend on materials being imported, still a lot of the technology is actually Chinese.
Very good.
And it's good to see.
Okay, let me call for our audience for questions. The first one, shall I call Calvin? Where's Calvin? Can Calvin?
I will try to unmute Calvin in a second.
Yeah.
All right, Calvin, you should be
Calvin, go ahead.
Hello. In all the discussions about electric vehicles, whether it's in China or anywhere else, no one actually talks about drivability, handling, speed, acceleration, all the fun things about driving.
Yeah. So, I mean, speed is never really something that. So, I guess I want to talk about China specifically here. Handling and speed and acceleration generally have not been the key selling points behind vehicles in China, right? Only for a few. It's all about image. It's all about brand. It's all about like the cachet that comes along with the car that you buy. Generally speaking,
the person who drives a car seldom drives it. Sorry, the person who buys a car seldom drives it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, especially in higher circles that buy Teslas, right? But even so, even the people who drive it, you know, the reason they buy a BMW is over something else is for that reason. And generally, if you take a look at the drivability reports that come out from these cars, the feedback is it's okay. It's never anything super special, but it's never a deal breaker compared to equivalent cars on the market. I mean, sedans and crossovers are not exactly super drivable. I mean, they're okay, but you know, they're not winning races, right? As long as they're safe, as long as they look good and they have a brand along with them, I think that's what's important. But yeah, it's a really, really good point.
All right, very good. Can I call Inchi Akas for question?
Yes, sure. Hi.
Oh, hi, go ahead.
Yeah, my question, as I'm coming from the healthcare section, and I'm more in the IP rights concerns, I would like to ask how in the automotive sector, companies deal with these changing policies and these IP conflicts which are maybe arising in an innovative environment, and how the situation in an innovation environment changed since the 1980s so far. Or what would be your point on that?
Yeah, so I mean, generally, everything around protecting your IP, protecting your know-how, has definitely improved in the country generally over the last even 5 years, right, 10 years. And in fact, there was a really good presentation on that also at the CI a few months ago, back in February, when we could all meet up, that Professor Dung presided over. More specifically in the EV space, there was a big moment when Tesla opened up all of its patents for free use, surrounding all of the cool innovations that it developed, and no doubt that has really proved super beneficial to a nascent market where companies typically would kind of go against one another for this sort of thing. I think, I'd say that that there is a lot of innovation, and there's a lot of IP that's being processed and being registered around electric cars, and has been for a very long time. And when it comes to policies, going back to your question on policies, the OEMs really, the government doesn't enact a policy on its own. It doesn't just come up with a policy. The OEMs are very much a part of that policy creation process, and they will all come together periodically at various associations. So there are various associations in China that allow these automotive manufacturers to come and discuss policy, or research institutes, as well as at a really high government level. So it's never really a huge surprise to these OEMs when policies change. Occasionally it is, but the government was also a little flexible in the way that it applies them. So, there is definitely an attitude generally, both within the market of EVs, or within the sector, and the government generally, to not have too strict a policy on either adapting to the new rules, or also IP regulation, in order to foster that market. I guess that will probably change over the next years as these companies start to compete harder for their dinner.
Thank you.
Right, the next one is Reggie Tricker.
Yep, hello. I work on a project called Green Charge, which is about trying to get renewable energy connected up to the vehicle charging grid. So these kind of big, heavy-looking cars presumably use quite a lot of energy. So what's the attitude in China? Is it just, well, this plugs into a coal-fired power station somewhere, and let's not worry about it for the time being? Or is this something that could come on the agenda in a way that it's a bit more on the agenda in Europe, that EVs are not just a solution because you can't see the tailpipe emissions and you don't have to fill it up with fossil fuel directly?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So I would say the problem is split into two. So on the one side, there is the problem of production, and then the other side is how it gets used, right? So there's a lot of investment in how do we make cleaner electricity. You might be fooled by the number of coal power stations going up, but there is a huge investment that is going into that. I think in order to people need the range in their cars. They need the size. They need the feeling of comfort. In order to buy an electric vehicle, that vehicle has to be comparable to the petrol vehicle they would buy. And the petrol vehicle they would buy is a larger sedan, or a large or an SUV crossover. So, yeah, I guess there's still big opportunities to be the person who generates the power, but I'd say that there isn't like a big connection between those two areas, which is a really great point. There should be, right?
Right. I think I will take the privilege to ask you, Paul, the last question. Now, the government policy currently is, so to speak, switch from globalization to internal circulation, 内循环, which means, perhaps in the next 10 years, China will become relatively isolated, supporting herself. So do you think from your point of view, this electric vehicle business can do that for China?
Do you mean bridge or stay domestic?
Just to support the internal circulation and relative isolation of the economy.
So, I mean, sadly, yes, right. So the way that automotives did work in the past, right, as I mentioned at the beginning, is in order for a car to be successful, it would generally have to have a foreign brand associated with it. And that joint venture that made the car would need to import parts and import expertise from abroad. What EVs have enabled the industry to do is reduce their requirement to import these things. So they still will need to import raw materials or some specific bits of expertise, but the total package that they used to have to import, they don't need to do it anymore, right? All the parts are made domestically. All the best parts, on the whole, are made domestically, and increasingly will be that way. Even the foreign automakers, the trend is Volkswagen are taking existing Chinese cars and sticking a Volkswagen badge on.
Really? Oh, good.
And well, I mean, yeah, it's depending on how you look at it. It's great from an industry point of view, but from a cross-border trade point of view, maybe it will make these large foreign auto OEMs reconsider their position and and be a little bit more humble when they're going into China. But yeah, sadly, I think to your point, yeah, there will be increasing isolation or the possibility of isolation in that space.
Yeah. Excellent, Paul, as usual. And I think we run out of time. Yeah. We can go on for another half an hour. So shall we thank Paul for this very avant-garde talk about China's next sort of the growth sector. We hope China will actually become a leader in this special kind of vehicle making, and that will be good for everybody, good for China, good for the world. Thank you so very much. Thank you for your participation in our webinar business briefing. Please join us again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.